Welcome to the Free Spirits Podcast, where we explore the functional and THC beverage industry. I am your host, Lars Miller, here with my co-host, David Gonzalez. If you're enjoying this show, please take a second to rate, review, and subscribe. It really does help us grow. Today, we are joined by Adam Ruhland, the founder of Birdie and Wild State Cider. You might know Wild State as one of Minnesota's fastest growing cideries, but Adam's latest venture, Birdie, is a new infused beverage brand designed for good times with a light lift. Adam, welcome.
Good to be here. Thanks.
You're building a THC beverage brand while running a growing cidery. What made you want to take that leap into cannabis beverages with Birdie?
Yeah, it's definitely something we pondered because we weren't sort of that first brand out of the gate when Minnesota kind of turned things on. And, a little bit reluctant because, hey, we're cider people. We built this alcoholic brand and, to think, it was never in our cards to have a completely different category under the same, company. But it just seemed like any good business, you see the growth and the explosiveness in this category, and we couldn't ignore it pretty much for much longer. We were about 9 months after sort of the initial launch of brands in this state, maybe 2.5 years ago now. And it's just kind of been a roller coaster from that point. But we were kind of thinking, we're a beverage company. We have all these systems in place. We have production, we have sales. We're using fruit and these similar ingredients. The barrier to entry for someone like us is quite low. And so we kind of had to take the dip. And, we started by selling other people's brands in our taproom and did quite well with that, to the point that we're like, we should probably just work on our own. And that, from there became Birdie.
Gotcha. Was there a specific moment, because you mentioned that there's a little bit of delay there, but was there a specific moment that convinced you that now was the right time or that the category was right for you guys?
Looking at LinkedIn is probably, I don't know if it's healthy or unhealthy, but, people are telling you what they're doing, and you're just starting to see more of we're doing more states and, we're selling this much of this stuff. And it kind of becomes like, if we don't get in now, we're going to I already felt like it was too late by the time we launched our brand. And I know there's people launching brands right now, and I don't think you have to be first to be the best, but it's definitely harder now than it was 2.5 years ago to get distributors, to get on the shelves, and to get any share of mind. So, we wanted to not miss the boat on that. And, I think breweries, had some of the similar thinking of maybe it's time to diversify. And diversification is really good in alcohol because there's a lot of negativity around the alcohol world right now.
So you also mentioned that the barrier to entry was a little bit lower for you guys, since you do have the cidery. How did your experience with Wild State shape the vision or structure as you began to build Birdie?
Yeah, I think we looked out there and, kind of decided that there's a couple ways we could enter this category. And, Birdie was created to be not necessarily marketed towards the typical cannabis consumer, if you will, I guess. So it doesn't have, euphemisms around smoking weed or anything like that. It's not inherently connected to that culture, and it's a natural product. So we know that people that are into the THC category are seeking a better for you, option, whether it's to alcohol or to something else. And, we felt there were a lot of products in not only in THC category, but honestly every category that are made with unpronounceable ingredients or things that you might just not choose to put in your system, if they were laid out in front of you and you had the choice. I drink everything. So it's not like we're not on a high horse about ingredients, but, it was our decision to take those same natural values that we use in our cider product and apply them to the Birdie brand. So the Birdie brand doesn't use preservatives, concentrates, artificial sweeteners, artificial or natural flavors. It's just fruit and the emulsion for the most part. And we wanted to be, if people are seeking a healthier alternative, we wanted it to be the best it could be in that realm.
Adam, I love that. So one of the things that, you mentioned that stands out to me about Birdie, and especially on the packaging side, is the tone of it is it's bright, it's confident, it stands out. If you do a planogram, the coloring makes it really pop. And you're right, it doesn't have like the proverbial mushroomy, heady, stonery kind of packaging that we see some breweries try to emulate, thinking that they're going to then attract, a stoner customer. And so I'm wondering for you, what was that process like internally developing that brand? You mentioned a lot of the ethos comes from the cidery side. When you guys looked at launching a brand new, basically product line and brand, did you want to have something that looked kind of similar to the existing cidery business and build on that brand equity? Did you want to start from scratch and have clear cut lines and saying, this is Wild State, this is Birdie. What was that whole decision process like when you were building that brand internally, given that you already had one?
Yeah, we knew that it would be a challenge to create a brand in a short amount of time, which is what a lot of this category has been up to this point, because it's still just so new and there's an urgency to get out there. But there's a lot of room in the category for brands that are more well thought out, more professionally designed packaging, marketed to the average consumer. You know, people throw out soccer moms all the time. And I love it and hate it in like the realm of this, who the customer is for this category. There's a lot of stuff in the category that probably isn't going to attract like that type of consumer, because while a beverage is destigmatizing, putting the pot leaf on it and, you know, doing all the things that are happening and leaning into that is probably more alienating to that type of person than welcoming. Out of the gate, we wanted to be, you know, to some extent, anyone can hold this. They're not going to have a stigma of, I'm holding a cannabis drink. No one necessarily has to see it and want to ask them a question of, oh, is there weed in that or something, you know? So we wanted it to be clean and, you know, approachable and just have a good shelf presence that wasn't too busy, wasn't leaning any direction. And, you know, from the initial concept, it sort of evolved into more of a generalized, you know, Birdie. It's sort of in that like racket sport, badminton, golf, you know, world was an initial sort of idea, but it kind of evolved into just more of this welcoming, clean and crisp design that, you know, when you put those cartons together on the shelf and you have bright colors, you know, it'd be easy for anyone to sort of latch onto that and not feel any pressure to, you know, or weirdness around what they're consuming.
Right. So with that as well, you mentioned, you know, obviously this is there's a lot of opportunities for brands here to actually build some brand equity, build something that stands out, to stray away from some of these prototypes. And so I'm wondering for you guys, you have this unique, I'll call it an advantage, if you will. You have a tap room full of people who you get to test this out on and get feedback from kind of in real time. The average brand doesn't really have that consumer testing ability that you know Birdie does. So when you guys were getting ready to launch or noticing selling other brands, did you start to see, I guess, a type of consumer, you know, try these products out the tap room that you said, okay, this is our core customer now, and now you have this kind of added benefit of seeing how these products kind of live and breathe in the real world that also helped inspire this brand? Like, it's basically a feedback loop for you, right?
Exactly. And I think, you know, I wish we were a little more sophisticated at the time and how we went about it, but because we know our cider customer and we're doing a similar thing in that category with, you know, our packaging says no weird stuff on it. We want it to be really obvious that it's just normal ingredients that, you know, you or I could get at the grocery store. And we knew that that was like, we were good at marketing to that consumer on the cider side. So we just sort of pivoted that to the same category. And honestly, there's probably some cannibalization from our consumers that are like, you know, this is an alternative. So, you know, it's important to us to not sort of be like super negative around alcohol. You know, we think it has a time and a place, but, you know, we're not going to be marketing, you know, completely as, you know, no hangovers and some of the stuff that, you know, can be somewhat subjective and, you know, might be more disparaging to the alcohol consumer or industry who you have to work with to sell your product anyway.
Absolutely.
So, you know, kind of taking a step back here and looking at how you went about building the actual product itself, the R&D process. So, you know, the constraints, flavor masking, emulsions, the stability of the product are all unique things to the cannabis beverage space. So what did that product development process look like when you first started working on it and building Birdie?
Yeah, there's definitely an element of building the plane while you're flying it, for sure. I think maybe a lot of people can relate to that, especially early on in the category. Working with alcohol and fermenting, you know, is a whole different world than producing NA products. And so we definitely had a lot to learn around stability, shelf life, potency over time, can liners, emulsion science. You know, pretty much well into the first year of the product's existence, we were tweaking things to optimize for what we just didn't know. So a lot of calling people and talking to our, you know, vendors about what research have they done, what's the best practice with pasteurization in this category, and you know, also just understanding shelf life for a non-alcoholic product and flavors when you're working with natural fruits. So we've had products that, you know, we didn't think stand the test of time, and we've had to phase out of them just because they didn't taste great, you know, when you get to a year on them. And so that's sort of expectation at this point that you have a year shelf life.
Yeah, I think that's a good call out. I think a lot of times when you have a commodities market, people really rush that production process. And so you have a lot of these products that taste the same, the quality really lacks. So I'm encouraged to hear you talk about the importance of focusing on flavor, but also the importance of shelf life and stability, because one of the other challenges is if you make it to retail and that product doesn't sell, then you're left as a retailer with all this product that does have an expiration date on it. And that's where all your cash is tied in as well. So it's encouraging to hear brands really take a step back and say, how do we actually give some longevity to these types of products, focusing on those flavor forward profiles, making sure that they stand the test of time, and a year's a good amount of shelf space and shelf time as well. Adam, my next question for you is something around more of the uniqueness of having a cidery, I don't want to say on the side, but as a sister company, and some of the advantages that gives you. We talked about the taproom, being able to get feedback from customers, learning from the previous brand, but from an operational and financial standpoint as well, I imagine there are some benefits for you. And so the ones that come to mind are, you're one of the few, we can call it vertically integrated types of THC beverage companies. And so I'm wondering, for you guys, what are some of those advantages that might not be so obvious to the outside world? Can you ramp up and ramp down your production depending on, demand? If you enter a new market, you're able to buy, things like cans and other supplies in bulk to help some of the unit costs. What are some of the advantages that Birdie gets from having this cidery as a sister company?
Yeah, and we've done co-packing as well throughout the last couple of years, and I've seen brands that are not obviously have that more of a model. And so it helped me understand sort of what advantages we do have by not having to operate that way. So like you said, we can, we have an established business with profit and revenue. So we're in the terms of our cash position, we're not sort of in this, constant waiting and having to spend to get more inventory. And it's this cat and mouse game.
Yep.
We're healthy and we're in a good spot. So, we can buy that full truckload of cans and, get the cost savings there. We do have a warehouse, we are a warehouse, so we can store the cans right there. We, it's our same team, obviously, and we're using a lot of the same ingredients. There's a pineapple cider that's very popular of ours, and we're making a pineapple. Pineapple is one of the ingredients in one of our Birdie flavors. So there's cost savings pretty much all around. I mentioned that we had a flavor that we're phasing out because we didn't think it stood the test of time. And we can make a 50 case batch or a 100 case batch of something, sell it on our website, sell it in the tap room, get that feedback, and be really quick about it. We can print a new label and just be done. We're not using digitally printed cans. We can just order a label, get it here in 10 days, and have a brand ready to experiment with pretty quickly. And, the flip side to that would be someone who has a co-packer with a 400 or 800 or more case run that they have to get in line for, prepay for, have all the ingredients for.
Mm-hmm.
And we can just be a lot more nimble because of what we've already got. I think at a large scale, at the highest scale, it could be a disadvantage because, if you're going to be making tens of thousands of cases at a time, some of these really large co-packers, they're experts and they can do stuff really efficiently. But, I think that's a scale that we're not close to yet. So
sure.
I think it's a sweet spot where we have all the capabilities to be nimble, to be quick, and to, not strain ourselves from a cash perspective, because we can make everything sort of just in time for orders rather than having to do a really complicated forecast of what's going to happen as you're constantly growing and then tell someone else to produce that and then store it and then hope it all, lines up. That's really tricky.
That's actually one of my later questions for you. All right, go.
Yeah. So, building a brand in this industry is something that requires a lot of education. It's something I believe you've talked about on the cider side of things as well. But what strategies has Birdie employed to educate consumers in the tap room, online, social, wherever you're showing up to do that? How are you educating consumers about THC beverages?
Yeah, that one's kind of tricky because the best way we have to communicate people is with our packaging. So, we believe that being really clear about what's going in our products, is giving the consumer at least a perspective of, a different option, essentially. So you can look at ours and see what's in it, and you can look at something else and see what's in it. And then you at least have an understanding of like, well, why does it taste different? Why is it priced different? And, trying not to confuse people with, I look at products all the time and I you have to be a scientist to know what some of these things are, how to use them. And, given the choice, I think everyone would choose the thing that they understand. So that's sort of been our, really clear packaging, always put recommendations on how to consume it. But as the category has evolved, the vision that, us and a lot of other companies had, I think, was that, there's going to be all these consumers coming in looking for the 2 milligrams and the 5 milligrams, and it's their first time and they're experimenting. And there's definitely an element of that. But obviously, we all know 10 milligrams have far and away been the most popular thing. And it doesn't feel like people are just coming in point blank and trying a 10 milligram. They must have had some other experience somewhere, or it's not something I would just jump in out of nowhere and try. So I think there's more understanding of just consumption already in the category than we maybe thought. And at the same time, there's still so many people that have no idea it even exists, which is the exciting part of it. People are still like, I had no idea this was in the grocery store next to the beans or whatever.
So speaking of education, one of the things that's obviously unique about hemp and THC beverages compared to traditional alcohol is the different channels at your disposal. And obviously, you mentioned the reason you jumped into this, and this is oversimplification, but seeing the FOMO on LinkedIn convinced you to say, okay, there's something going on here. I want to jump in. And so the nice part about these beverages is obviously there are different channels for education. There's different channels for selling. And so I was curious, on LinkedIn, has the D2C bug infected Birdie? Is that something that you guys are actively looking to invest in, expand, to go after? I know it's maybe a newer thing. And obviously for a lot of cidery companies, you're not starting off in D2C, so it might be this brand new thing. So the question is, one, first, is it even worth it to do that? And then B, is Birdie using channels like D2C to help educate the audience a little bit more, acquire new customers?
Yeah. And David, I don't think at the same time, but that we used to work together or at the same company, many years ago. And so I was in the digital marketing space and, creating, what's that?
Were you at Drip?
Yep. Yeah.
Ryan? Okay, perfect.
Yeah. So, creating a physical product after having worked in software for so long was something I was excited about, because I just was kind of tired of selling digital goods, basically. So I spent a lot of time in e-commerce and, moved over to cider, and it was completely the opposite. Like, you're selling heavy physical stuff in stores. So if you think about some of these, THC beverage brands that are primarily D2C and they're starting to dabble in wholesale, I think we're like that on the other side. So we're primarily wholesale, and, we switched over to Shopify in the last couple of months and are building out a true platform where we can understand customers, get a little bit more data. One advantage we have is because we have the taproom, that's sort of our fulfillment center. So we have bartenders who, when it's slow, they can pack boxes and send out orders. We're doing a couple orders a day on the THC side, but we haven't really, put a lot of effort into the outreach side. So it's people that are finding us or have had the products and they're just coming to us. So that the doors are open for that. But we're a little bit, there's some trepidation around trying to just casually jump into D2C in this category, because it seems like there's a lot of ways to screw it up really fast if you don't do it right, or you're not prepared to get shut down, or you're not prepared to invest. So, I don't know the answer to what the long-term play is. There's ways to make beverages work in the mail, and people I think are showing that right now. But as it becomes more proliferated, into retail, will that still hang on forever? Maybe there's 10 more years of it. I don't know. But it's tough to think that the least efficient way of moving these goods around is going to be the winner. And, but it's enough right now that we're certainly looking at it, and, we have plans of how to do better in that part of the business.
Awesome. Love it.
We were talking before the conversation offline about distribution and how it is obviously very critical. What channels has Birdie found to be the most effective for reaching your target consumers, other than the tap room, obviously?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty much, through alcohol or wine and spirits wholesalers and then direct, so we work with a couple of retailers, that can handle, pallet shipments, direct, where it doesn't disrupt the relationship that we have with our existing wholesalers. And then it's just like we have on cider. There are some places where we have the same wholesaler for cider and THC. There are many where it's just THC and wholesale. THC is, maybe 20% of the taproom volume, total in terms of on premise or to go. But, in terms of wholesale, that's probably 96% of the volume of THC total. So it's a good component of the tap room, but just like you would sell an NA or an alcohol brand, that seems to be where it's at and where we're putting more of our efforts for sure. And I think a
And are
couple,
you
months or years ago, go ahead.
are you currently only in Minnesota, or are you in multiple states right now?
I'm gonna say I don't know the number, so I'm not gonna say it, but we're in the teens to over 20 states, either direct or with wholesalers. So quite a few.
Adam, one of the things that comes to mind is you've probably had experience launching distribution for the cider part of the business all over the country, probably some preformed relationships with distributors as well. Can you walk us through what that process is like, basically coming up from a net new product line? And again, you do have all this infrastructure in place for it, but landing those distributor contracts, expanding into different states. What is that process? Like, how do you forecast demand for a net new market, for a new category where it is a different type of sell rate, different type of retail footprint? So what's that planning process like? And how do you guys decide which states to go after?
Yeah, which states to go after is kind of like where do the wholesalers seem most invested, balanced with the legal landscape. If you're trying to think about what's going on in the spring, because that's when a lot of legislative sessions are happening, wholesalers will tell you, we're not doing anything right now. Like, we already have brands. There's potential bans in place, or, Texas, whatever. No one wants to, they're sort of in holding patterns during that time. So we're kind of coming out of that a little bit more. And, so knowing where retailers and wholesalers are invested is the easiest way to say, let's jump in. It's certainly getting harder to find distributors. It seemed like, maybe there was a point around a year ago where a lot of distributors came online and just grabbed a ton of brands. And, I've talked to some of them. I'm like, how did you decide on, the 20 brands that you have? And they've said, literally, it's the people who came here first. And so in some ways we're like, but we're actually established, and we know how to work with distributors, and they'll say to you, I don't think all these brands are going to be here forever, which is kind of a weird thing to hear from a distributor. So, maybe just a piece of advice there is that, be nice and stay in contact, because it's going to evolve, and it already is. And then in terms of forecasting, it's complicated. Spreadsheets is the best we've ever figured out. One thing that's tough for this is there's not even a central like sales record keeping place. So in cider we have VIP. We can understand where distributors are selling, what stores, when they're buying, what they're buying. You have all the data. When it comes to THC, depending on the wholesaler, you don't have as much of that. And especially when you're selling direct, you only have what they're willing to share with you.
Right.
So, you're kind of just making educated guesses around past performance and future growth. And, back to the thing of the fact that we can make it for ourselves. Mm-hmm. I think there's a lot less of a burden on that, because if we're wrong, we can quickly make another batch, and you could turn it around in 9 days. If we're right, or if we went over, we can cut a batch and just not produce it. So, we're constantly towing that line of like, we just want to have a few pallets of everything left at any given moment, so that we're always cycling through it, and we're not, letting it get old or sitting on too much money.
Yeah, I don't think people realize how big of an advantage that is. Like earlier in the conversation, you highlighted it perfectly. The challenge or the guesswork of saying, okay, I launched a new market, I landed a distributor, hopefully I have a co-packer or something in that area, but now I have to reach out to that co-packer, get on the line, get scheduled, hope that I have enough, or if I do too much, hopefully that inventory isn't just sitting there collecting dust, and then all your cash is tied up in there as well. And so it's such a hard position to be in as a retailer, or as a brand, because you're making this educated guess and you're hoping that it works out. Well, what if a law changes overnight, and then all that product that you just invested in and made now doesn't have anywhere that you can sell that product? And so obviously that's a huge advantage for you guys. One of the other questions that comes to mind is, it's such a no-brainer that you would obviously push product through alcohol distributor networks. But one of the interesting parts that we hear a lot of is, for THC beverages, you get this opportunity to work with different kind of distribution networks, because products don't need to just be sold in liquor stores. Has Birdie started to use or work with any distributors who aren't necessarily just focused on, liquor stores, or is Birdie focused on getting into C stores and gas stations and other types of points of distribution that might be different than what you're accustomed to from the cidery side of the business?
Yeah, there's kind of like a couple tiers in the wholesaler level. There's a lot of these, there's small craft distributors. There's small craft THC distributors. It's sort of, they came out just in this category alone. We've definitely seen some of that. Then there's sort of the mid-level wine and beer distributors, and then, the big Miller AB sort of network. And, all those tiers are going to have different nuances to working with them. At the lower end, in terms of the small operations, we've had our share of, conversations and relationships that have just not continued because the smaller ones, we've had some fold, we've had some where they just couldn't keep up, they have trouble paying. Distribution is really hard. And so settling into like a mid-range distributor, and we're not super bound to like they have to be a beer distributor or they have to be a wine and spirits one. We think it's more important to have share of mind within a specific wholesaler than for them to be focused on beer or something else. So, maybe it makes sense to go with an AB wholesaler somewhere because you might be like in their top 5 brands and they're going to care about you. Where, if you're just like, I need to be with a beer wholesaler because that's sort of a mantra, you might be their 25th brand. And if you've ever been the 25th brand somewhere, like,
yeah,
you're not getting a lot. They're going to expect you to do all the heavy lifting. And so we didn't want to be in that position. We know that, we operate profitably and we don't have investment capital. So we're not the most aggressive about getting reps into markets initially when there's 0 sales. And so we need a wholesaler that at least acknowledges that they need to grow the brand to a certain extent before we can really get a person there to help them.
Right.
So this leads into the final question here, Adam. And what's the ultimate vision for Birdie? 5 years out, is it exiting, seeing how big you can grow it yourself, something else entirely?
Yeah, I think that everyone probably wants to give a noble answer and say, I'm building this thing for my family for 100 years. And, but like pretty much everyone I talk to, like we're trying to create value that ultimately, can generate more value in the future, whether that's an exit or someone wants to take an investment, or it just is a really profitable cash flowing business. That's the honest answer of what it's all about. So, we got in business because there's an element of capitalism that, we find exciting and interesting. And so, we're going after where the people are and what they're buying. And ultimately we hope that somebody else sees value in what we're doing and wants to get connected with us.
It's almost like, well, it just reminds me of like all the people who started selling masks during COVID. Like it's there, the opportunity is there. If you can do it, why not? You don't have to say I'm going to be a big mask producer one day. If it's able to make some money for you and grow your business, like go for it. And to your point, if it's providing value and it's a solid product that people love and enjoy, you don't need to have some glorious like NASDAQ listing one day. It's just about, all the ingredients are there. Build a strong brand, build a good product, people will love it. And that's all you really have to do. So I love the candid answer there and just the realism in the conversation. There's a lot of people who obviously have very high hopes, high expectations for this category, but I think there's something to be said about if it can just help you on a day-to-day basis, you can tack it on to your product offering. And it's another thing that adds value to the entire company as a whole. Like, why not? And I think that's...
Yeah, and like we appreciate that this category is a positive impact for many people. And like, but we're also not at the same time trying to say that, we're out to change the world. We're participating in hopefully a better option than, maybe what someone else is used to behaving like or choosing. But at the same time, we sell alcohol and, we're not trying to, make smoke and mirrors and say that we're fixing global issues here. These are good products, good alternatives. We want to do it safely, naturally as possible. And ultimately, we want to, have a positive outcome for ourselves and our customers.
Absolutely.
Adam, thank you. This was a really awesome conversation. Thanks for pulling back the curtain and giving us that operator's point of view on running both a cidery and a THC beverage brand. Real quick, where can folks try the product? Just taproom up in Duluth or other places there in Minnesota?
Yeah, we're widely available through Total Wine in 160 stores, and then distribution across Minnesota, Wisconsin, Tennessee, and all across the Southeast. You can buy it online at drinkabirdie.com. And, I'm on LinkedIn, so anyone reach out and happy to, help brands and share what we've learned along the way.
And for our listeners, if you like this episode, please do rate, review, and subscribe to the show. It does help us bring more conversations like this to your feed. And until next time, guys, cheers.